Boop-a-doo-doo. Here we are. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the For the Love of Language podcast. I am Stacy, the linguist.
And I'm Authentically EJ. And today we are super excited because we have a special guest with us. So my friend Alexis is joining us. She is an ASL interpreter. ASL is American Sign Language, for those who aren't familiar. So she's fantastic, and we're excited to have her join us today.
Yeah, and for those who are listening and are not with us live on Twitch, this is a great opportunity to go back and check out the VOD on Twitch. Go back and check out the recording. As we all probably know, ASL is a very visual language, and so to get an additional enhanced listening experience, I recommend going back to the VOD and checking it out at twitch.com/Stacy the linguist, where we've recorded this live.
Yeah.
All those who are here, you're in for a real treat.
Yeah, we're super excited. We just want to add in a quick post-recording message here. Since we will be talking about ASL, it's worth mentioning that none of us are actual members of the deaf community. ASL is a second language for Alexis, and ASL belongs to the deaf community. We definitely don't want to misrepresent that, and none of us is representative of the deaf community. So Alexis has been kind enough to come onto our podcast and speak about her knowledge of ASL and share her experience using it as an interpreter, all for the love of language. So back to our conversation with Alexis. So maybe let's just start out really broadly. Alexis, what led you to become an ASL interpreter?
Well, in the deaf world, I have a very boring story as to how I got here. And that is I have no deaf family, no deaf friends. At least I didn't have any deaf friends. I just was in high school and my mom said, you need to have a foreign language credit. And I'm like, oh, I don't want to do Spanish or German or French. So there was ASL and I thought, well, that looks fun. So I started with that. And then in the end of my last year, taking that in high school, my teacher told us about interpreting and the profession. And I kind of learned all about that and thought, oh, that would probably be good for me someday. And when I graduated high school, I went on to get a bachelor's that included ASL interpretation. And I got a certificate of program completion from a technical college. And then I was state certified, and I've been working for 5 years.
That's amazing.
Yeah, you don't hear about a lot of people who started a language in high school and actually continued with it or actually learned much from it that they remember. So it's awesome that you started then, really enjoyed it, were able to carry it into an actual profession.
Yeah. In fact, my dad was like, you can't do ASL. You're never going to meet any deaf people. You'll never use it. I'm like, well, I'm going to anyway.
Right.
Yeah. What's really interesting as well is something that not a lot of people know about. I'm assuming you're from the same state and area that EJ and I are from back in Utah. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Something that's very interesting is ASL isn't always offered as a foreign language in some schools. That's something that's kind of unique to a couple different schools. So in some ways, you had sort of a unique opportunity to have access to ASL as something that is considered like a foreign language and not like a part of a disability chunk of the school or whatever. And so it's really great that even though you didn't necessarily know anyone who was deaf, you still had access to it. So much so that you've made it a part of your life.
Yeah, right. That's exactly right.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about ASL as a whole. So firstly, there's lots of different sign languages, right? And each one is totally a different language. So American Sign Language isn't going to look at all like sign language from other countries. That's, I think, a common misconception that people have is like, oh, you're making symbols, it's got to be understandable. It's not the case. It is a full language. How do you normally describe American Sign Language to others? Like, is there anything about it that you think people normally have big misconceptions about?
Yeah, debunk some myths for us.
Well, yeah, that first one's a biggie, is that it's not a universal sign language. There is a universal sign language, but my understanding is that it's not a true language. It's very, I don't really know what it is. I don't know much about it. I know that they use it at the Deaf Olympics. So they'll have people who come in with their sign language, and they'll be using them, and they can't understand each other. You have interpreters there who know universal sign language and who can kind of help mediate. But it's not a real language in itself. What's important, I think, for people to know, general people, but I think linguists or people interested in language might already understand that ASL is its own language. So many people will assume that it's universal, and it's not. And many people assume that it's just a manually coded system to represent English.
Yeah.
And they have that too. We call that manually coded English, but it's not, that's not a real language, a true language in itself. ASL is its own language with its own syntax and its own culture, that people who speak it identify with. And ASL is actually most closely related to French Sign Language, because the person that brought it to America was a French man, and brought it to America because he saw deaf people educated in France using sign language, and he brought that to America. And then he used that to educate the deaf here in America. So it's actually most closely related to French Sign Language, but it's used in North America and Canada. And it's actually nothing like British Sign Language. So that's kind of what's interesting, is that people are like, oh, well, the UK, they speak English as well, so it must be like ASL. And actually their sign language in the UK is from a very, very different parent language entirely. I don't know anything about it. And then Spanish Sign Language, of course, is kind of South America, I assume. And yeah, there's a lot of different sign languages all over, and they're all very unique. So once a big myth is that ASL is just English on the hands. It's nothing like that. It does borrow. I will give you that. ASL will borrow some words from English in the use of finger spelling or other things like that.
Yeah.
Things where, or we call it sometimes initialized signs, where the sign is used with the initial of the English word that it might represent. But every language does that, right? English doesn't have its own word for déjà vu. So we borrow it from French, and every language does that. And ASL is no exception, but it is its own language. And people who, I know the alphabet, you don't know anything,
Yeah, the alphabet is just the starting point when it comes to ASL, much like, learning your letters is just the start to understanding English, spoken English as a language, right? Like it's just one piece of a much broader linguistic capacity.
Right.
Definitely. You did mention a couple times that, it's very different from English. I think people are probably interested a little bit in how. Could you give us a couple examples of how, grammar is used differently in ASL, or just a couple of the significant differences?
Yeah. So one thing about English, and I assume this is true for most spoken languages, is they are linear. And that means that when you form a sentence, you put words together in a certain order to create meaning. Okay, so it comes out in a line. It's linear.
Yes.
ASL is, you still have to have things in order. You can't put it all out there at once, but you have space.
Yes.
You have space to create meaning. And so it's a visual spatial language instead of a spoken linear language. So those are very different. So I can say a lot with just a couple of signs on my hands if I have the facial grammar and I use the space to say that thing. And so that's something, when we talk about interpreting, that it's a skill to learn, because if you're just trying to sign as fast as someone is talking, and every word gets its own sign, like, you'll never keep up. Instead, you have to think about how does ASL use space to create what you're trying to say? And then you use your space to get that meaning across. So I'm trying to think of an example of like, I don't know. I think of like a long sentence that you could interpret. I don't know. Of course, now I can't think of any
I totally
examples.
understand. Like we run into that all the time, even with spoken language. We coming up with examples of things on the fly is kind of hard. So completely understandable. But yeah, you're 100% correct. That is something that is very like unique to sign languages, is the interaction with space and how that can kind of like influence a language, right? And correct me if I'm wrong as well, but a lot of ways you can tell like the difference in dialects in certain sign languages is by where people, like how people use space, whether it's like you're signing close to your body or far from your body or a little up higher or lower, can tell a lot about a person's mood, a style, where they're from, what they learned. Am I correct about that?
I'd say a lot of, well, actually, an interesting statistic is that men or male signers will sign bigger and away from their face. And women tend to sign kind of closer. So you'll have certain like signs that have to be, on your body, but you might have, a man like all the way down, use that sign. And then a woman might it's just kind of a smaller signing space. But I actually have been told that I sign like a man because I was taught by men.
Oh,
interesting.
interesting.
And so I picked up and I copied their language. They were my language model. And so I kind of picked up their tendencies. And so I think that's kind of settled down over time as I've worked more with women interpreters and have kind of developed my own kind of style a little bit. But in the beginning, I was told that. But I mean, you do have dialects. You have dialects. I would say that it's more of a sign choices. In my experience, it's more sign choices that will say, oh, that's a New York sign. That's that's an Eastern sign. That's a Southern sign. And sometimes I'll have trouble understanding them. I think much like we might have trouble understanding even British English can be very different, and use the words that we use for something else or words we don't recognize at all. And then enough of those, string them together and suddenly you're lost.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not even sure what you're talking about anymore. And that has happened to me before interpreting. And I'm just like, this particular client, I don't understand you because you're from not around here and you use signs I'm not familiar with and I don't understand yet. So I'd say dialect is more of a sign choice kind of.
Yeah. How do you handle instances like that when you're like interpreting for people and you realize that there's a dialectal difference?
It doesn't happen very often, but there was one time that it happened that I found myself really in trouble. That I just was watching this person sign and just like, it was all going over my head. And there were a lot of other things I needed to do. I needed to move. I was watching her from the side also. And so there was a light, there was a window behind her. It was crazy. So I needed to move to understand her better. But in the end, they got a replacement, someone who did understand her. And they're like, yeah, I wasn't experienced enough, I think, and didn't have as much control. Later, I had another assignment with that client and did fine. Because I was like, no, I need to make sure I can see you right on. So where I'm sitting, I need to see you instead of the side of you. And so that did fine. But other instances where it isn't so drastic or there are fewer complications in play, I just kind of, there's a time where sometimes you just kind of need to get the gist that you're like, okay, this is the concept I'm getting. I'm missing a lot of details maybe, but here's the main concept. Package that up in English and send it on its way. That happens sometimes too, when I just can't catch all the details. There are strategies for that though. I can ask, wait, what's that sign you keep using again and again? And they could tell me, if I have to, I'm not understanding that sign. And they might, and sometimes if it is a dialect problem or a dialect difference, that they might say, oh, that's right, I'm sorry, I can't use that, new interpreter, you don't know me, or that kind of thing. And then they realize, oh, like I have to be careful maybe if I want to be understood by this interpreter. So
that's so fascinating. I love that. There's a bunch of things you mentioned that I hadn't ever really considered, like, different genders signing differently. That's fascinating, needing to make sure to be really strategic where you're placing yourself in the room as an interpreter. Like, that's super interesting. I've done some interpretation myself. Just, growing up in different countries, I would interpret for my parents and for other people quite a lot. And then I actually volunteered as an interpreter and was looking into going into court interpreting in Utah. I actually went through their classes and then observed part of a court case, and it was super depressing. And I was like, this is actually not for me. But I love interpretation as a whole. And so I would actually like to, talk a little bit about your experience as an interpreter more. And like you've mentioned a couple things that you need to take into account. I guess, can you tell us some of the, what you would call the more interesting things you've learned being an interpreter?
Oh, well, I mean, that could be, what have I learned about the profession, or what have I learned about the world? Because I find myself in every kind of situation. I've been in childbirth. I've been in many, many medical appointments. I've given bad news in medical appointments. I've been in fights between parents and kids, schools, and I've been in a courtroom. I haven't done court interpreting, but I've been in a courtroom. That was cool. I've done so many things, and currently I work at Weber State, and so I'm interpreting some classes, and I'm every class I go and I interpret, I'm like, oh, cool, I get to learn English, dance, physics, like whatever, math and maths I haven't learned before, and it's really cool, because interpreting, I feel like a fly on the wall sometimes.
Yeah.
And that might seem weird because I'm like right in there, helping to communicate, but it's not my communication. So where I've been where I've been put in a place where I've had to swear and yell at a doctor, I've felt very much removed from the situation, kind of looking around going, yeah, you two figure it out. I'm not really here. Technically I'm here, but I'm really not supposed to be here. So I just, so what I've learned, there are many, many things just by virtue of being privy to information and exchanges. And that's one reason that confidentiality is so very important.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially in those like highly sensitive situations and medical situations, just broadly, even in like an academic setting, I feel like privacy is still like very important. And like you said, it's a very interesting thing to be a fly on a wall, especially in some of these like sensitive cases.
Yeah, it's really cool. I mean, I find it really, really fascinating, very fun to be around, but then definitely that comes with the token of confidentiality. Is number one in our code of ethics, confidentiality for everything that we do, because we are in places that no one else would have people.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I think it's very interesting, and you don't have to like tell the story, but I think it's very interesting that that you often find yourself in situations where other interpreters might not be necessary, like the parent and child relationship you mentioned. With spoken language, often that's like shared in some respects between a parent and a child, and it's sort of a unique situation to have a parent or a child not be fluent in sign, and so having to step in those situations, I think is something that's unique to sign language, where there can be a disconnect even between intimate family members.
Yeah, that's a very, very sad story, and true of very, very many deaf people. 90% of deaf people have hearing parents, and that means that when they're born, they have no language model living right there.
Right.
Their language models, who are typically parents and family members, have to learn their native language as a second language themselves. And so that can, and sometimes they do that. Sometimes parents learn ASL and have deaf mentors come and have them interact with the family and teach signs and teach them the language and the culture. And we find very high success rates of those deaf people in life and in language, that they're able to acquire language at an appropriate time in a way that's natural and native to them. And they become wildly successful. But more often, the deaf children are taken from ASL and not allowed to use it, or just aren't taught it, or they are expected to rely on hearing aids and cochlear implants and other medical interventions, to speech therapy and things solely, and cannot acquire language correctly. And that makes it very difficult. I have someone that I know who, that's exactly his story, is currently his social skills are very lacking. And it's not because he has some kind of social impairment. He may by now, but it's not because it started out that way. It's because when he was growing up, he did not have access to language. He missed everything that's going on at home. And so this story of these people is, it's what do you hear when you're at home? You hear kids talking to each other. You hear your parents talking to each other. You hear your siblings talking to your parents. You hear words you don't understand because there's such an elevated vocabulary from your parents. And then when visitors come over, you see how they interact with each other. So you see how it is when guests come by. You see how they interact with the store clerk. You see all of this stuff. And one of the famous stories is the tooth fairy, because many deaf people, they don't know what the tooth fairy is. They've never heard that, because their parents will only go to the extent of using signs and trying to communicate the important things. And the tooth fairy gets left behind. And so many other things get left behind because they're not considered important enough to discuss right then. Another terrible phrase is, I'll tell you later, tell you later, I'll tell you later. So when the deaf participant is sitting at the family dinner table and something is funny and everyone laughs, and hey, what was funny? What was funny? And the parent or the family member says, I'll tell you later. Later never comes. They miss all of that. And so that's it's great when I get to go into assignments where deaf parents and their kids, or deaf people and their hearing kids, or deaf people and their hearing parents can talk to each other. Sometimes if, there's an assignment and you have some family members there, sometimes they don't understand each other and I have to interpret between them. You can tell that there's a little bit of there's a struggle there in that relationship, because communication is everything. Communication is relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. Like 100%. Without that medium, we're kind of like, people can just get left in the dark. With that being said, I'm curious if maybe you have advice for people who know people in the deaf community, or parents who are hearing parents to a deaf child. Do you have any thoughts, recommendations about learning ASL as a second language, things that maybe people should be aware of, or things that they could incorporate, things that might make it easier for them to kind of work ASL into their lives so they can help the people around them?
Yeah, definitely. And what I say is what I've been told, obviously by the deaf community, and that's something that I've seen work out. So I believe it. And that's that, I have deaf people tell me that, well, we feel like if we tell parents that their deaf child should sign and should be with the deaf community, we feel like parents think that we are telling them that we're going to take their child away.
Yeah.
And that we're going to adopt them into our little, group. And that's not how it is. They say we want them to be bilingual, bicultural, and that's what they really want, is that there are deaf mentor programs through the Deaf Center in Salt Lake City. And so people with deaf children around, or whatever, or deaf babies that are born, it's a really, really good resource, because they'll send a deaf person to your home, and that person will be a language model for the baby, and for the, or the child, or whoever, and for the family, so that they can communicate, and then they have their own identity and their own culture in the deaf community. And that's really important for them to have a place to belong. A lot of them will say the deaf school is the place to be. There's a lot of research to back that up, because they are taught directly in their own language. I have interpreted elementary school and high school, and that is so much harder than medical interpreting because it's for a myriad of reasons, but elementary school and high school it's new content and it's a new language on top of that. So
Yeah.
to have a student in high school or elementary getting everything that they see through one interpreter, which is an interpretation of what I feel like that person is saying. So it's not coming directly. There's so much that can be missed, and that can make it very difficult. And some people have been very successful in that setting and some people haven't, but there are options there, obviously. But
Yeah, I can imagine it's especially difficult for kids because not only is it like new language, new material, but like those formative years are in like formative. That's when you're developing relationships with people and trying to like learn how to be a social person outside of your family home on top of all of this other stuff. So it makes sense when you say that like a deaf school is the place to be because you're eliminating that one of those barriers, that like linguistic barrier between people and kids, so they can develop socially in a more natural way, as opposed to having to go through somebody else, an interpreter, to get that socialization.
yeah.
Definitely. I have a question actually. So I think, a lot of people, especially in the US, only speak English and don't have a lot of experience necessarily communicating with people from other cultures, other languages, that kind of thing. So a question that I have is like, if you have someone who, has a deaf neighbor move in, and it's like a family that only does ASL, only speaks ASL. I don't know if you should say speaks ASL or only signs.
I do.
Okay.
I do. Some people, the deaf community is so varied. Some people feel like it's a language. You can speak ASL. That's fine.
Mhm.
Other people are like, it is not spoken. We don't speak it. We use it. I speak ASL. That is my opinion.
Cool.
Say what you want.
Thank you. Glad to hear that. But yeah, what would you recommend if someone's like nervous? They're like, I don't know how to communicate with these neighbors. Should I just avoid them? Would they appreciate it if I go over and just try and like write on my phone? Like what's the best way to, relate?
Yeah. I mean, that again, every person's a different person. So, but my experience has been if you care about getting to know a person and you're not sure how to communicate with this deaf person, but you feel like, oh, well, they're a neighbor now, I should be polite, and maybe you don't know they're deaf. So let's imagine this happens. So someone moves in, I notice the moving truck, they're packing all their stuff into their house. And so a few days later, I think, oh, I'm going to be very nice. So I'm going to go and meet them. So I go, I knock on the door. That doesn't work. So I ring the doorbell. I know they're home. So I ring the doorbell. Okay, a couple seconds later, they open the door and I'm like, hi, my name is Alexis. You just moved down the street. And they're, pointing at their ears, shaking their head, going, And then I realized, oh, you're deaf. So now we have a situation where I came to be polite and now I feel like just leaving without saying anything else. I mean, I think at that point, it would be, I think, a good idea maybe to pull out your phone and just text, my name is Alexis, let me know if you need anything, and show it to them. Many deaf people have that experience anyway. They don't get interpreters for every little thing because sometimes it's just easier to go to the grocery store and pull out exact change, or a restaurant and write back and forth about, pointing, that kind of thing. So deaf people in the area, I think, have a very good experience of that and what will meet the needs of the situation for them. And so I think that would be a great gesture. And I think you're going to have very few deaf people who would be upset by that. More deaf people would be upset if you walked up to a couple of deaf people signing in a restaurant and just waved and started spelling nonsense or something. But as a high school student, I remember seeing a couple of deaf people in a theater and walking up and practicing what I knew. Hi, my name's Alexis. What's your name? And the very simple things that you learn when you're in high school. And And they were happy about it. Some people I found to be very, very appreciative that you took the time to come and practice your skills.
Yeah.
And some people are like, every time I show up to anything, I always have someone who thinks they can talk to me and they come up and they bother me and I just want to go to a show, you know? But I think my experience has been those are the minority. I think as long as you have a good intent to like reach out and have a relationship with someone and have a connection with someone, I think that any way that you try to communicate with them is going to be appreciated. And I think that that's not something to be afraid of just because it's something that you don't understand or something that you are uncomfortable with. It doesn't mean it's something that's, that you should be afraid of.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I love that. And I think that applies to like, if you had neighbors move in who were from anywhere in the world and didn't speak your language, like you try talking to them and you realize they don't speak your language, you can pull up Google Translate on your phone. You can, show your friendly intent and find some way to communicate. And if you really care enough, you'll make it work. Now it's definitely going to be difficult. And, someone in the chat mentioned I would try to learn the basics of ASL. And like, that's a really great gesture. The main thing that I would say about that is expect it to take a lot of work if you actually want to really learn the language. Like that's going to take a ton of work and a lot of time. And it very well, like if you can put in that time and effort, like I'm sure that would be really appreciated. But I think a lot of people underestimate the amount of effort that goes into actually learning a language.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same as a spoken language. It's complex. So if you think learning Chinese is hard, learning ASL is also hard. It's hard in different ways, but learning a language can be a tricky thing for some people.
Yeah.
I think we can wrap up with a question from the chat. We had a really good question from Chris Winters here in the live chat. He asks, how would you rate different topics on a difficulty scale in terms of interpreting? So everyday things in life, teaching a subject, security and safety, medical topics, stuff like that. What is maybe the most difficult for you to interpret?
Okay, so how would I rate different topics? Well, the thing about interpreting is kind of like a little bit like language acquisition. You don't learn a language when you're born to when you're 5 by learning every single combination of words and tone and everything. You don't do that. What you learn is rules and some vocabulary. And then you learn how to put those together. And that's why kids will make mistakes like the plural forms of words are wrong. And they'll say mouses, because that's a rule. I learned this rule. And they try to apply it to everything. But that's how language is acquired, is you learn rules and now you can apply them in every situation. And interpreting is similar, I think, in the sense that you learn strategies. So as you learn your target language better, and if I'm interpreting from English to ASL, my target language is ASL. And so if I learn my target language well, then I know how to express things in a lot of different topics in a lot of different ways. And so my challenge is I am always improving, and interpreters who have been interpreting for 20 years are still always improving. The challenge is to figure out how can I more efficiently do this? And so some subjects are difficult, for me, and for other people, they're not. Math is a difficult one for me. Technology can be tricky for me. Any subject with jargon or long words that I don't understand the English meaning of.
Right. Yeah.
That's difficult because the source language, there's a block there. If interpreting is a process, you have a source language. If it's English, I have a source language come in, and then my brain processes that meaning, and then I interpret it on my hands. And if it's the other way around, then I have a source language coming in, I process it, and then I speak in the output language. And if there's a block right there in the understanding, well, that's a problem. So any word I don't understand English wise can be like, okay, well, I just like make my best guess, or I can finger spell it. There's a lot of different strategies. The things that get me, like medical interpreting, I feel like that's very easy.
Oh, interesting.
Me. And this is the reason. It's always actually been the easiest. That's stuff that I started as a novice, and I still, as a professional level, still do, and it still is the easiest thing I ever walk into. And it's because there is an opportunity for me to stop and ask questions. It's because of the setup, who is involved. It's not platform interpreting where I have a million eyes on me and I cannot stop the speaker for anything because that's not appropriate. And if I miss something, I need to either just move on or figure it out or hope I have a team or whatever. Mm-hmm. But in medical interpreting and in small group situations where the register is casual or consultative, then I know I can stop and ask questions or clarify if I need to. So that's what makes that easy. It's not so much the topic, because medical can be very deep. Right. But medical also offers a lot of opportunities for showing. And that is, we use classifiers, which are hand shapes that represent things. So if, for example, in a recent appointment we were discussing a rib issue. And so my ribs, here were my ribs. Okay. And with my forehand shape, with kind of curled fingers to show that those are kind of ribs. And I could point to each finger to show, and it would happen to be the third rib we're talking about. So the first, second, third rib. Okay. And that space between them, that. And so we were talking about the injury that happened there. And so see, this is very visual and it's very clear. So that's a strength I have. I feel like and I've been told in my use of ASL is that I can be very visual and use my space effectively. And so medical interpreting is a lot of that. Abstract topics. Oh, you know what? Here's what's really hard. Here's what's a hard one for me is motivational speakers. Oh yeah. Graduation speakers, church. Oh, those are just terrible. I'm not very good at them yet. I'm still working on it, still developing because it's abstract. Right. And I have to, so in ASL where it's visual, what I have to do is listen to the topic and say, okay, now I need to make that something I could hold. So I have to just like think, now how could I take this abstract concept about this fluffy thing? And English motivational speakers say so many words that mean nothing. If you listen, you'll be like, oh, like when I go to interpret it, I'm like, you haven't said anything. You said all these words and it doesn't mean anything.
They're all just buzzwords and you're like, but what's the core of it?
Exactly. So it's like, what is the meaning? And there's a lot of that process. Another very difficult thing is intimate register. So the problem situation I had that I was talking about earlier with the dialect, in that meeting, they were using a very intimate register. There were 4 or 5 signers, and I had no team, and I felt very like I was drowning. But one thing is that they were doing a lot of, remember when that happened? Oh yeah, that, blah, 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 blah. And they would never expound because they were just, this happens a lot at home, so best friends or families who are like, if I say to my husband, hey, what was that thing we were talking about? And he's like, oh, it's this. Okay, great.
Yeah, or like inside joke type things. Where there's just like no reference to it.
Yep. So that's really hard.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Fights are, I don't think those are, sometimes those can be hard if the signs aren't clear because it's just like, blah, 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 blah. But in that case, I'm just yelling anyway. And any sign I recognize, I'm like, okay, so that, sometimes actually that's kind of easy because it's really to the point. There's really none of this like blah, 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 blah. No, it's just shouting accusations or whatever. So it's
wow. That's so fascinating. I had one experience when I was interpreting that really stands out to me as most difficult. And it's kind of what you were saying of like, if you don't know the word in English, like if you don't actually know what's being talked about, it's really hard to interpret. Because if you know the word, even if you don't know exactly how to say it in another language, you can explain it, you can talk around it.
Yeah.
But I had one time when I was interpreting, and I think it was into Russian. And the person speaking, it was one of those group things where I had the headphones and was speaking to a bunch of people in headsets. And the person speaking started giving this really elaborate car analogy and was talking about these really specific parts of a car that I literally had no clue what he was talking about. So I just said into the mic that I had, I was like, well, now he's going into an analogy about car parts that I really don't know what he's talking about, but this seems to be the point.
There you go. Yeah.
That was the best that I could do. And it was, it was still appreciated. Like the actual specifics didn't really matter in that situation.
Mhm.
But yeah, for me, it's like, if it is that jargon, if it's something really specific that I really don't understand, then I can't interpret it. So.
Right. And that would be considered an appropriate strategy in something like that, where you're just like, I don't, and sometimes that requires a lot of, we call it processing time, or sometimes it just gets called lag time.
Yeah.
Because if I'm watching a signer or I'm listening to an English speaker and I'm like, okay, where are you going with this? Or I'm not quite understanding everything. I take a longer lag time when I voice, because I am watching the signer for a long time. So if I'm getting like this big, long story, one client in particular, I have a hard time with, and I work with her on a regular basis, and I'm still learning how to understand her well. Because ASL is like her fourth language itself. And she brings with her a knowledge of 3 other languages, and they sometimes overlap. And so I sometimes find myself watching her going, okay, here's this story. And my client, my hearing client, will be like, is she saying anything? Oh, yeah, hold on. Like,
Yeah,
I gotta get
it takes
this.
a sec.
And sometimes be like, okay, it's a story about this, and here are some details. And basically she's making this point, based, and it's not that simplified, but sometimes it does take this, okay, here's the gist, and this is the point, that's like, okay, if you don't understand everything else, break it down till you're like, okay, here's this raw idea that I think they're trying to make, and then give that. So yeah, that's definitely an employable strategy.
Yeah. Super, super interesting. Well, is there anything else that you would like to bring up or mention before we finish up here?
Yeah. Any last minute thoughts for our viewers and listeners? Things that any like takeaways about ASL, sign languages in general like interpretation stuff. It's been really cool to hear your perspective as an interpreter as well. It's been such an amazing conversation.
Well, I mean, the one thing is, I don't know, just the ASL, it's a language like everything else. So it can kind of be cool when you take your other podcasts, and when you because I listened to a few of them before today. And when I hear things about language discussion, my mind goes to the second language that I know, which is ASL. And so almost everything that you talk about language can be applied to ASL. It has parent languages. It borrows, it has a culture. It evolves just like everything else. It doesn't have gendered pronouns. That was one I listened to, and I was like, that is one that does not have gendered pronouns. But it grapples with a lot of the struggles that languages do, and it has some of its own, and it's a living, breathing organism that just is always evolving, and it's just like every other language. So I think that can be fun when you're doing other podcasts, or when you're researching other languages and you find something interesting, or you discuss a topic about language, and then you stop and apply it to ASL, or think about how that looks in ASL, or how that might be. That can be a really interesting discovery. For me, that's just the norm. Like, my husband's second language is Spanish, and when we talk about language, which is rare, but we still sometimes do. I tell him, the language I'm thinking about is ASL, and so let me tell you how this goes. And it's sometimes surprising for him to be like, oh yeah, I never thought of that before. Mm-hmm. That's just the world I work in, but it can be fun when you kind of stop and realize that, oh, there's a culture around this. There's a population around this language, and there are frustrations, and there are values, and they're just like everybody else. Where everyone comes from, and everyone has, that there's an identity associated with it too. So
yeah, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experience and knowledge here.
Yeah, this has been absolutely fantastic. What a joy to have you. Also, if you have additional questions for us or Alexis, you can also find us on the For the Love of Language Instagram, and you can send us a DM, and we will happily answer questions. If you have thoughts for future topics, you can hit us up there as well. So don't forget to check back. The For the Love of Language podcast Instagram also has updates about when we release episodes and stuff. For those who may be new, you can find our episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. And we try to release them weekly. We've had a crazy summer. So we're a little bit behind and things are a little bit scattered. So we appreciate your patience with us. But we love having you here. Thanks again, Alexis. And everybody else, we will see you later. Thank you all for being here.